So I'm going to focus a lot on plants throughout my lessons, although today is more focused on a bigger picture. And I'm going to be telling you a story, and you can think of that story through these topics here. So I'm going to be defining agriculture and farming today. I'm going to get into food justice. I'm going to talk about some agricultural practices, a lot of definitions, but I don't want you to worry about that too much. I'll tell you what to really focus on. And then the other days, I'm going to get into ecology and ecosystems on a much broader scale about some plant anatomy and how the plants are interacting with environments. And then your role within that in terms of assessing a site and taking care of those plants and identifying some very common problems and being able to learn how to identify them. And this is a very basic overview kind of thing. So for all of those different lessons, so you can just take that knowledge and keep building on it as you learn other things moving on in your career essentially. So the flow of this is that I'm always going to give you an overview of what we're going to learn that day. I'm going to do some poll everywheres. I have a few of them today actually. And then I'm going to do the lesson when the poll everywheres are within that. And then I have a section for you to ask questions if you like, but then within the quiz that you take at the end, you can also ask me questions there. And then I'll preview what we're going to do the next week. So the only time I'm not going to do a quiz or a preview is on the last day because, it's the last day, so there's nothing to really look towards at that point. Okay. So today I have entitled Part 1, The Power of Definitions, because like I said, there's a lot of definitions. Okay, so I want to start, of course, with the poll everywhere and just let you define agriculture and farming in your own way. So as you can see at the top, it says you can go on that link that I put in the chat, or you can text it to join and start answering questions. They can be really short definitions too, and cool. That's a good one, growing food on a farm. Yeah, raising animals, definitely one of them. And other material for human use, that's a good one too. Taking care of land. One's a study, one's an act. That's an interesting way of looking at it too. Okay, so these are some pretty good definitions. So I'm just going to move on. You can still add to it if you'd like. So if you were to look it up on Google, let's say, and you just say what's agriculture? You would get the science or practice of farming, including the cultivation of soil for growing of crops and the rearing of animals to provide food, wool, and other products. So for me, when I look at this definition, I'm thinking if agriculture is the science or practice of farming, then what is farming? And if you look at what's farming, it's the practice of agriculture or aquaculture, which is a catch-22. So you're thinking, okay, well, let's look at other definitions because that was from a different source. So here you have farming as the activity or business of growing crops, which people were saying are raising livestock, so taking care of animals. Agriculture being the acts of farming and raising livestock. And then this more intense definition that comes from a part of agricultural law within the state of Vermont. So it's getting way more specific, and this definition actually goes on until it reaches I think H. So there's a lot of parts to it. Then this is one that I really like as out of all the ones that are there, I should say. So the science, art, or practice of cultivating the soil, producing crops, and raising livestock in varying degrees, the preparation and marketing of resulting products. So basically like you're taking care of this land, you're taking care of the plants you're trying to grow for whatever purpose, and you're trying to raise animals, and then you're going to like sell those things, or you're going to give those things to other people. And all of these are pretty good definitions, but it's a matter of who has like the best definition. Is there a clear authority for who gets to say what is or is not agriculture or farming? You could say that that's the USDA, which is the US Department of Agriculture. I mean, they have major influence over what's happening within agriculture, right? So what is their definition? The problem is they don't actually have one at all. If you try to look for one, you're not going to find it. In fact, there was even a study as recent as 2017 that was saying that there may be lots of definitions and all different types of ways of defining things from other subfields within agriculture, but there isn't like a more broad definition of agriculture. But I'm wondering, does that really matter? Do we need a definition, at least one from the USDA? And what do you think of that? You would say yes, 70%, 30% said no. Okay. Interesting. Well, we'll come back to that. So, because what I really want to do is be able to talk about the terms that actually do exist at the USDA in terms of the USDA actually defining those. And these terms will also just be useful to you as you're learning more about farming and gardening and food systems at large. So I'm going to get into food systems, sustainable food systems, what a farm versus a farmer is, sustainable agriculture. There are subsections within that, and then conventional farming. Again, a lot of definitions, and I'll tell you which ones to like really focus on here. So food systems are very vast, they're complex, and they concern everything going into it and everything coming out of it. It's centered on food, which is why it's called a food system, and it's centered on humans. So we're thinking about this in terms of ourselves as people. And given that it has many continuously moving parts that are shaped by every human on the entire planet, it is very dynamic. So it'll change with time, it'll change with your location, and then it alters depending on what conditions are there. And so taking it as like the simplest definition that is from the National Agricultural Library of the USDA is everything from farm to table is a food system. That's one way you could think about it. Okay, so then what is a sustainable food system? So another definition given by the USDA, which is actually through the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization, or FAO, is a food system that delivers food security and nutrition for all in such a way that the economic, social, and environmental basis to generate food security and nutrition for future generations are not compromised. That sounds like a lot of jargon, but basically what it's saying is that in a system that's sustainable, you can make money from it. You can also make sure that people are being fed and taken care of, and that your environment is being taken care of as well. So you're thinking about it in like 3 different really broad sectors, or like categories, if you want to think about it like that. So now let's think a little bit about one of the key places where you're growing a lot of our food, or at least the components of our food, as well as who is producing that food. That would be the farm and farmers. So a farm, as defined by the Economic Research Service of the USDA, so the USDA has all these different departments, so that's what all these little abbreviations are of. So the farm is any place that produced or sold, or normally would produce or sell, at least $1,000 of agricultural products during a given year. So it's really focused on not only growing food, but how much money are you making from it? It's really centered on economics. And then the definition of a beginner farmer, actually, instead of a farmer itself, they don't really get into that, but just someone who has operated a farm for 10 or less years as a sole operator, or with someone else essentially has the same amount of experience as you. So if you wanted to have a farm and you were like, okay, I have a farm, I'm able to produce $1,000 worth of food or whatever it is that I'm growing, or animals that I'm raising, but I've only been doing it for like a year, you would be considered a beginner farmer. And if you were to do that with another person who's also been growing for 2 years even, or 5 years, or 10 years, that person would also be considered a beginner farmer. But as soon as you start growing with someone who's grown like for 15 years, you're no longer, that person is no longer a beginner farmer. Okay. Oops. So now we're going to think a little bit about the types of agriculture in which a farmer or grower engages. Okay, so this is a very long definition, but it's actually very important because this is one that was defined by the Farm Bill, which comes out every 4 years or so. Does anyone know anything else about the Farm Bill? You can just put that in the chat if you'd like. Ever heard of it before, Farm Bill? You also put that you don't know. Okay, that's fair. So the Farm Bill is really this like massive piece of legislation. Right. Well, yeah, that's very, very accurate. So it's like this really large, massive piece of legislation, like I said, that comes out every 4 or so years. Sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 6. It varies. That's really focused on determining where resources for the most part. And it's focused on agriculture, of course, which is why it's called the Farm Bill, but also is impacting education, nutrition that happens in schools, and everything beyond that. So much is going into this bill. But so from this, they came up with this definition so that they can determine like where those resources are going to go. So it's prioritizing, again, the economic, social, and environmental sustainability of caring for plants and animals that are being used for people. So that's basically the gist of like what we're getting out of sustainable ag. And that's what I was saying earlier about sustainable food systems. So sustainable food systems have sustainable agriculture. Okay, so then there's regenerative ag. So oftentimes now, at least, sustainable agriculture is combined with regenerative agriculture. So in this definition is increases our land and soil biological production base. It has a high level of built-in economic and biological stability. It has minimal to no impact on the environment beyond the farm or field boundaries. So in terms of like minimal impact, it's really just thinking about negative impact in that way, because there's no way you can really do anything and it not impact the environment in some important way, because we're all a part of the environment. And as you notice, I don't have it saying that that's attributed to the USDA, and that's because the USDA uses Robert Rodale's definition. And that name might sound familiar because he's the son of the founder of the Rodale Institute. And that institution is considered like this prestigious entity within agriculture. So that's why they're using this definition. So some practices, which I would emphasize here, of regenerative agriculture includes like no-till, which means you're not disturbing the soil as much as possible. You're trying to keep that to a minimum. You're cover cropping, which means you're putting down different crops to help build up that soil. You're rotating crops because certain types of plants may take up a lot more nutrients than other types of plants. So you want to make sure that you're not exhausting the soil. You're mulching, you're composting, you're using animal manures. Again, it's really focused on soil-based things because soil is like a really big part of being able to take care of the land and life. So of course there are other like types of growing that don't involve soil, but I'm not going to get into those today. And then there's organic farming or organic agriculture, and the USDA defines that as the application of a set of cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that support the cycling of on-farm resources, promoting ecological balance and conserve biodiversity. Again, a lot of words to say the same thing of applying a lot of things that are a lot of practices that are supporting life, that are supporting our environment, our ecosystems. And it might sound like a term that is very related to sustainable agriculture. And that's because it really is like a subset, essentially, of regenerative and sustainable agriculture. So it's considering, again, the soil fertility, a focus on that, but not just soil, but it's also talking about seeds and like other types of planting stocks. So if you wanted to take cut off a piece of a plant and put it on another, that's called a planting stock. What you're feeding animals, if you're raising animals at all, how you're managing pests, how you're managing weeds, and diseases, how you're maintaining the identity of a plant. So basically, if you grow something and, plants may like pollinate or cross-pollinate, you want to make sure that it's still like a plant that has not been, altered in some significant way or not grown with some type of pesticide. What is the difference between regenerative and organic? There really isn't a really like substantial difference between the two. Regenerative is like this giant overall umbrella, you can think of it, and organic agriculture would be this subset within that that's considering like what I'm saying here, like soil fertility, seeds and planting, stock. This is stock, but it should say stock. Animal health, grazing. So it's just like a subset of that, essentially, is how you can think of it. And more specific practices within organic agriculture would be rotating the crops, like I was talking about, composting, adding manures, preventing things. So, and instead of just waiting for bugs to come eat your plants, as you see in this picture to the left, there are like these white translucent cloths over them. It's because it's like protecting it from insects and trying to like prevent things from happening. So it's just a subset. Does that clarify things? Wonderful. Cool. And it might also include biocontrol, which basically you're using insects to eat other insects, for example. Cool. And then lastly, we have conventional farming. It's not, the definition from the USDA actually is not at all what you might think it is. It's actually concerned with the use of seeds that have been genetically altered using a variety of traditional breeding methods. That doesn't include biotechnology. So thinking about going in there and editing genes, like, doesn't count. And they're not certified organic. So in a lot of ways, conventional farming is defined by what it's not as opposed to what it is. And in this particular definition, again, is focused on seeds. I'm emphasizing that. And then the practices that are not associated with the USDA by their definition, but ones that we think about when we're thinking about conventional farming might be like selective breeding or tilling, which is really what's happening over here when they're making rows for the plants and they're really disturbing the soil. The soil is very barren because they're not really covering the crops, like doing cover cropping of any kind. They're using a lot of pesticides and they're using a lot of water, otherwise known as irrigation, which is when you're using water to take care of plants. So that's what you would consider to be conventional. So earlier I asked if having a USDA definition of agriculture really mattered. 67% of you said yes, absolutely, and 33% of you are like, no, it doesn't. Well, I would argue that it does absolutely matter. Okay, but why do you think it matters? So that's the question for you to answer next. Ooh, that's a good one, thinking about it in terms of education. What to do and what not to do. Limits and restrictions, so you're thinking regulations. That's a good one. Understanding some more education. Setting a precedent. Ooh. Ooh, so the government can make policy and control environmental harm. I like that one a lot too. These are all really good. Next all farmers. Connection, that's a really beautiful one as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of these answers are starting to get similar. So I'm getting like education, thinking about connecting people, thinking about policy, laws. They're really great answers. So if you want to think about the food system in like a very like crude or like very simple kind of way, there are 6 parts to it. You can think of it being like production, processing, distributing, consumption, access, waste recovery. So like all of these things are feeding into each other and they're all ongoing, happening simultaneously. And it's in a way a little bit cyclical, but they're interacting in different ways. And then there are many different things influencing them. So there's, again, economics, thinking about money. Environmental, like, is there a lot of rain and it floods a crop and now you can't produce as much and it slows everything else down. Social, thinking about what crops we even grow, like why we consider some crops to be weeds and others not. And then there are a bunch of other things like technology and research that are also a part of those other three, but have their own category or could have their own category. So within that, thinking about resources and things that are influencing them, one of those really big resources, if we're thinking about like the bottom part, environmental, the left part, I mean economic, a lot of those resources are related to money. And they're covering a variety of areas of agriculture, these 6 programs here. And those are, again, a part of the Farm Bill. So that big piece of legislation that comes out and is talking about all these different ways in which agriculture is being influenced and who gets what, it's mostly going into like these 6 subsets of programs here. And it's focused on like environmental quality, it's focused on like conservation, and just really trying to push people to do things that are better for everyone and are sustainable. So let's take a closer look at one of them. So this is what this specific program, Agriculture Conservation Easement Program, okay? So this one in particular is helping landowners, it's land trust, so people who get a bunch of land together and they're giving it to people in very specific ways, and other entities to protect, restore, and enhance wetlands, grasslands, and working farms and ranches throughout conservation easements. So who might a program like this leave out? You can put guesses in the chat. Since we know what a farm is, since a ranch is basically the same thing, but instead of crops, you're talking about animals, talking about wetlands, grasslands. So money is going towards these programs. Who's left out of that, do you think? Any guess is a good guess. Tenant farmers, non-land owning farmers. Ooh, it's a good one. Any other guesses? Small farms. One more guess, maybe? Large corporations that work as farms. Okay. So for this example, I would say a community garden, let's say. So that's someone who's going out and you just decided that you have this plot of land, maybe that land's owned by the state, and you're growing all this food for your community because your community doesn't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. So you're like, I want to grow those. But if you're growing them and just giving them away, are you selling $1,000 of agricultural products in a given year? No, you're not selling anything. So you're not counted in this. And there are a lot of farm bill programs that leave out these giant swaths of people who are growing foods, who are growers, who are farmers, in a definition that's more broad than the one that the USDA uses. So aren't those community gardens gardeners, growers? Aren't they farmers? Shouldn't they be farmers? Sure, there are other programs for them that might exist. There are lots of different ones that try to send money towards people who are growing that aren't considered farmers. But oftentimes, whether you're a farmer applying for these particular programs or another program, if you're a gardener, you have to have the time to apply for those grants. And also the people who get those grants and get this funding have to have had grants in the past, are more likely to get them. So it's just, again, this weird cycle where it's leaving out a bunch of people. And if you have a full-time job and you're also on this farm all day, do you have time to go and now write a grant proposal and send it out that might be like 20 pages long? You probably don't have that time. So there are definitely some people who may be a little bit more advantaged than others who have that time to put all those resources into it and get more funding to support their larger projects. So if you're wondering why is this giant gap? Has anyone been talking about this? So many people have been talking about this for quite a while. So our system is actually fraught with a lot of problems, from systemic racism to wealth inequality and so much more. And even the USDA has been thinking about that. What happens if we start to expand farm definitions, like who are we leaving out, like how does that change how we're collecting data and like what we're sharing about everything, and who can actually have access to programs. These are questions that lots of people are thinking about, have been thinking for a while, especially now with newer industries coming up. But that is why we have food justice. So another definition that I will emphasize here is, so a definition of food justice is to achieve equity and fairness in relation to food system impacts in a different, more just and sustainable way for food to be grown, produced, made accessible, and eaten. So basically, food justice is all about making sure that everyone has access to the things that they need, and that every part of the food system is accessible to people regardless of where you are and what you're interested in and how many skills you have. You can get those skills and you can contribute in a way that also sustains all of us. So I was talking before about like economy versus environment versus social. Like food justice is about making all of those things sustainable so that you can eat the food that you need to eat and grow whatever else you need to grow to make clothes or whatever else. So there's someone named Dr. Bobby J. Smith. He actually went to Cornell as well as I did. And basically, there are so many different definitions of food justice out there, like there are so many definitions of agriculture, that essentially what these definitions are doing, again, this is a lot of jargon here, so I'm going to explain it, is being able to show that there are like social things, there are cultural things, political things, economic things, environmental things that are all related, and food justice is just a way of addressing all of those things, something from a perspective of something that we really need, that really unites us, that everyone can understand to some extent because we all eat. And it's thinking about like the larger structural issues that are happening within our society. Okay, so this is actually a diagram that was created by a student-run grocery store at Cornell University that's in Ithaca, so really far upstate, to speak to food justice. So within that, it's giving you more ways of looking at food justice. You can think about the social aspects of it. So how good does something taste? You know, how convenient is it? So in this grocery store that I was also helping run when I was there, we were thinking a lot about, okay, so there are some foods that, you know, we see a lot in grocery stores, but what do people like to cook? So they would do a lot of surveys to see like what foods are people really interested in. So we ended up bringing in something like callaloo, which is a plant also known as pigweed to us. It's considered a weed, but to a lot of people in like the Caribbean, that's like a very strong staple for them, including myself. So that's something you're thinking about in a social realm. Then environmental, like where are you sourcing this food from? So this grocery store is thinking, okay, if we want to be embodying food justice, like where are we getting our food from? So we would really make sure to source from grocery stores, or not grocery stores, so source from farms and other like distributors who are really careful about, you know, how much water they're putting into stuff. Are they doing things regeneratively versus conventionally? Thinking about how much waste is going into it and how much food they, like as a grocery store, how much food are we wasting when we're trying to have a grocery store? Are we ordering too much and not enough people are buying it and then we're throwing a lot away? Like that wouldn't be a part of food justice. That would be very wasteful environmentally. Then economic, again, thinking about money, thinking about fair wages. So there's nothing that we can do more directly other than changing, you know, how we source. Like maybe we're not going to source from someone who doesn't pay their farmers a living wage and are not treating their farmers well and not giving them breaks. But we could also just educate people about it. So that was a big part of what the story did, was teach people about different ways to support different people within our food system. So all the farm workers, all the people who are considered the farmers. And then supporting legislation, maybe we're saying like, oh, there's this legislation that's out, or there's this policy that's out, like people can support that, which would be considered lobbying, which is a different conversation. And then the last one, which we have like a really big impact on, is diet and health. So if we're trying to think about people's overall well-being, their mental health, as well as their physical health, we can put up a lot of signage and we can have demos. We did different demonstrations in the store. We were talking about like, oh, you can eat this food with another food and it helps, you know, this particular disease, and also thinking about hunger. So we try to keep our prices as low as possible, which also feeds into the economic portion again, so that people who are experiencing food insecurity on our campus have the ability to access the food that they need for the lowest price possible. our slogan was like, we're cheaper than Wegmans, and Wegmans is like this very like popular grocery store that treats their workers fairly well, and is fairly affordable. But we were like, we can go even lower than that. So that was a part of what this particular organization was doing. So I just wanted to show you that there are so many different parts of food justice within this. So I was talking a lot about the cultural parts of it. So that would be considered food sovereignty. So that is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate foods produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agricultural systems. So again, that speaks to that larger concept of food justice, of people having the power within their own food systems. Like everyone can contribute to it, but not only just very broadly, but that you have access to things that you find are healthy, that you find that are culturally appropriate. So that would be the distinction there. It's this one's more narrowly defined than food justice. And this particular definition is coming from the Forum for Food Sovereignty in Mali. And this was through like an article that's much larger that talks about all, again, so many different definitions of food sovereignty. A writer, Raj Patel, has really great books that you should read, was talking about this definition. Any questions about the difference between those two? I know that sometimes can be tricky. Okay, I'll keep monitoring the chat just in case. Okay, then there is food security. So food security is all about being able to access food whenever you need it. So this one's really easy to distinguish between food sovereignty and food justice, because it's basically saying if you are really hungry and you're like, okay, I need food, like how easy is it for you to go get that food? Do you live like 5 minutes from a grocery store? And then even if you do live 5 minutes from a grocery store, do you have the means to cook that food, to prepare that food? Do you have the knowledge to do it? So food security is not just thinking about, you know, is the food there, but how close is the food, and what foods do you have, and do you have the means to actually make that food into something that is very edible, that tastes great, and is something that allows you to be healthy, allows you to be active. That's the definition that the USDA is using. It's also a very similar definition to with the FAO, which I was saying before is that UN organization that was given in 1996. So having access to food, that's what food security is about at all times. Okay, but who is doing the work of food justice? So I just wanted to take a moment to talk to you about all these different organizations, and I would definitely consider Rewild to be a part of that, because if you're thinking about environmental justice, if you're thinking about food justice, all of those are different types of social justices, and they're all interrelated and they're inextricably linked, so you can't separate them. So the work that, you know, an organization like mine, Black Farmers United New York State, is doing, where we're focused on like educating people and focusing on policy, that organization, the work that we're doing is absolutely connected to like planting more native plants and making sure that there are different insects that are coming back that are very important, that are beneficial to growing food, but also have a lot of cultural importance. So all of those things are very much so interconnected. So on the left, I wanted to show you the ecosystem, because it's my organization, like a part of a group that I'm a part of, it has my organization in it, and I'm just so passionate about this work, and anyone can be a part of it if you're very interested in making sure that everyone has access to all the things that they need. So essentially, this ecosystem is trying to give people access to land, it's trying to give people access to markets and education and training. So there's like the 3 organizations, Black Farmers United, Soul Fire Farm, which is a very popular one, that's in the capital region, so like near Albany, that's further upstate, like east. Farm School NYC, that's not too far from you, that's in New York City, that's teaching like very hands-on education to people. And then so now you have this education, but it's, again, we're thinking about, you know, food sovereignty and being able to grow your own food and having access to resources. It's like, okay, I have education, but how on earth am I supposed to, you know, have the money to actually start a farm in the first place, or start a community garden even? So that's why we have people like Carbon Hill, which is like distributing food to different places, and Black Farmer Fund, which is giving money to a more marginalized group of people to make sure that they have access to the money that they need to start those farm or agricultural ventures. And then land access, which is a really big one. So you might have money, you might have the education, but you're like, I have nowhere to grow anything. Of course, there's like small space farming that you like growing that you can do, or gardening, which is very important and very valuable. But if you want to do like an acre of land, like where are you going to find that land? And if you're, on Long Island, like all of you are, it is very, very hard to secure agricultural land. Like we are not an agricultural like island at all. If you're going to do agriculture, you're usually doing it in Suffolk County, which is fine, but it also means that you're going to be spending a lot of money to do it. And then also a lot of the time, if you have that land, you don't have access to it as an owner. So if someone decides that they don't want you on their land anymore, then you have to go. So we're all about trying to make sure people can own that land and own it together. And so again, people have access to what they need. So that's just like one large group that's working in the Northeast, but what about everyone else? Like I said, there's Rewild, there's a National Black Farmers and Food Justice Alliance, and then there's Heal Food Alliance. So if you're like, wow, this concept of food justice is really appealing to me, you can take like different courses that they do there. You can just get involved in like labor movements and all different ways, again, to be very active in what you're doing. And I see people mentioning Plant to Row for the hungry in Port Washington. Great, like there are different organizations everywhere, and these are just a few of them. So if you want to get interested in like active in them, you can talk to me later if you'd like, or you can find ones out there and add to your own list. So just so you know, you're not alone, and that there's no one working. It's not like there's no one working on this. There are a lot of people working on this constantly. Okay, and from this work, there have been a lot of emergent definitions. So this concept of food apartheid or food desert, have you heard that term before? Like what's a food desert or food apartheid? Put it in the chat, or you can come off mute if you'd like. A good definition. Yeah, areas without access to food. So again, I was talking about food security. So those are communities where a grocery store is very far away or access to food is very far away. But again, there is no actual like definition from the state, New York State, the USDA, like the whole country. There isn't a definition for that. So food apartheid in particular is talking about, it's the same thing as a food desert, but it's basically acknowledging that, a desert is something that's naturally occurring and it's also full of life, although we don't necessarily see that. And apartheid is something that's man-made. So this is something that doesn't have to exist, that does. So there's a reason why that someone doesn't have access to food. It's not like it just happens to occur that way. So right now there's actually an assembly member. I don't know if any of you know your assembly districts, but District 125, if you happen to know where that is. There's an assembly member, Anna Kellys, who's working right now with Cornell University to try to establish a definition for this word. And as I was mentioning earlier in this presentation, you want that definition so that funding can go towards something that's important. So being able to have people working towards resolving food apartheid so that they don't exist anymore. Like that's why they're working on that and trying to put that into legislation to support those communities. And that's because of the work that was done with like the organizations that I was mentioning back here. So like Black Farmers United, for example, like there are about like 15 of us that met with her office to talk about what a food apartheid was. And I met with a few people at Cornell to talk about like what is a food apartheid, what's a food desert, and what that term could mean and how we could define it and legally use that in legislation. So again, that work actually has like real consequences. And socially disadvantaged farmer, that's one that the USDA uses. That's what they've been using to try to get resources to communities that have been disinvested in. So basically communities where it's been intentional in the past and sometimes even currently, unfortunately, where funding and other resources like land has just been taken from people. So the concept of a socially disadvantaged farmer, which does have its problems, is to make sure that those people have access to those resources now. So that's been pops up in a lot of legislation that's doing some work, but not enough, because that's always the story, right? And then there's the stressed farmer, which is about agriculture, not about food, but is I don't know if you've been paying attention. I know it doesn't really apply to you whatsoever, but there's been New York State cannabis laws coming out, and that's one of the terms that's been used in it. So a farmer who's been very similar to a socially disadvantaged farmer who doesn't have access to things, but it's not just about racial and ethnic prejudice. It's about economic injustice and people who maybe have gone to jail previously for a law that doesn't exist anymore. So and that's again based on a work of a lot of people who are getting together and saying like, this is not fair, we need to do something better about it. So there are real life results for doing the things that we do, other than being able to see something grow, which is also an accomplishment in and of itself. They're like bigger things that are trying to change like very large structures and issues happening within them. But I do want to mention that is just one small but very important part of all the different ways that you can affect change in some type of way. So there are policies that you can think of if you're thinking about like our political system. There are practices. So if you want to be like, I want to make sure I'm doing regenerative agriculture, like that's something that you can do. How resources are going from place to place, which we were talking about before. But then there are these other parts that we don't really think about as much, or that we don't speak about out loud as much. And those are relationships to people. Maybe you're not behaving the same way towards someone if you knew them better. Power dynamics, maybe someone inherently has more power than you, like, your parent, they have more power over what you can say and do right now because they're trying to protect you and do the best for you, hopefully. So you're thinking about, how can we change those dynamics a little bit to make them more equitable? And then mental models, like how are we thinking about things? Like, do we think about things in terms of like, I can do this and I can do that? Or are we thinking, no, you can do either one of those things? Like there's no both and thinking here, you have to do one or the other. So changing how we think about things, how we're relating to one another, connecting to one another, what power dynamics are there, like who has more power than another person, as well as like those more tangible, very obvious things like practices and policies and where resources are going are all important for us to change the systems that are not working for us and making them better. And we can do this slowly, we can do this quickly, it doesn't really matter, but as long as we're working on all of those parts, we can affect change. And that's honestly, if you believe in it. I know some people have other ideas about how change can happen, but I think as long as we're all working on a piece and talking to one another, we can get things done. So I just wanted to point that out. So if you're like me and you really like definitions, you're probably wondering like, okay, but here's this definition that not only thinks about, soil and crops and livestock or like animals as science and art even and a practice, like what's wrong with this definition? I mean, there's not anything inherently wrong with it necessarily. I mean, but to think about things in terms of products that you then market, I mean, does it make sense always to think of things as something to sell and always centering humans and us being the most important thing about everything? I don't know. And by that, I just mean it's not up to me to decide, what is or is not important. I have my own thoughts, but it's not up to me or any one set of individuals, or at least it shouldn't be. So I think the future, however you look at it or whatever you believe in, can be shaped by all of us, and it absolutely should. That's my presentation. So thank you so much for listening and participating. And I'm wondering if any of you have questions for me, because I know I gave you a lot of information. But you will have this presentation if that's the question that you have.